Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. The Rise of Skywalker is frequently categorized as a conclusion, a cinematic act of closure designed to definitively resolve the Skywalker saga. Critics and fans alike often approach the film as a logistical exercise in tying off narrative threads, focusing on whether it succeeds as a final chapter for a decade-spanning franchise. This surface-level consensus positions the film as a reactive entity, a collection of narrative knots being tightened under the pressure of audience expectation. However, this interpretation misses the more complex reality of the film. The Rise of Skywalker is an exploration of the permanence of identity, positing that who a person is remains fundamentally fixed regardless of the historical baggage or biological legacies they inherit. It is a film about the reclamation of the self from the weight of ancestral ghosts. The film operates within a reality governed by the cyclical nature of power. The world building, particularly the emergence of Exegol, reveals a geography of stagnation. While the Resistance represents the desperate hope for progress, the First Order, and its ultimate manifestation in the Final Order, represents the vacuum of a rotting empire attempting to bootstrap itself back to relevance through sheer, salvaged force. The architectural hierarchy of this universe is stark. The Resistance lives in the cluttered, nomadic ruins of the past, characterized by repurposed tech and communal struggle, while the Sith legacy manifests in the sterile, gargantuan, and monolithic structures of a long-dead era. This visual contrast demonstrates that the struggle between these factions is not merely political but existential. The Resistance is building a future, whereas their enemies are attempting to exhume a lost epoch. At the center of this tension is Rey, whose journey is defined by the epistemic fracture triggered by the revelation of her lineage. The narrative places her in a state of crisis regarding the fabricated ego. She enters the film clinging to the hope that her identity is tied to a virtuous origin, only to discover that her genetic narrative is anchored to the ultimate manifestation of evil. Her trauma is not just a personal wounding but a foundational questioning of her own moral nature. The film argues that her internal reality is not a product of her bloodline but an active, conscious choice. When she rejects the title of Palpatine, she performs an act of radical existentialism, demonstrating that the burden of a name, or a history, does not equate to a predetermined moral destiny. The antagonist, Kylo Ren, serves as the perfect mirror for this struggle. His arc is characterized by the performative nature of his darkness. He wears a mask, not merely to intimidate, but to hide from the inherent instability of his own identity. His logic is the ultimate pragmatism. He believes that burning down the past is the only way to escape its influence. Where Rey chooses to integrate her past and transcend it, Kylo attempts to erase his, becoming a slave to the very cycle he seeks to destroy. Their dynamic is parasitic, as both are desperately feeding off the emotional capital of the Skywalker legacy to define their own value. The moment of their ultimate confrontation, the return to Ben Solo, is the film's thesis realized. It is the rejection of the shadow and the final surrender of the fabricated, violent ego to the reality of the individual. Technically, the film utilizes scale to underscore the insignificance of the individual against the crushing weight of institutional history. The wide shots of the massive Sith fleet, achieved through dense, monolithic CGI, serve as a visual metaphor for the overwhelming nature of the past. The camera often moves in ways that emphasize this scale, trapping characters in wide, cavernous spaces that make them appear small and vulnerable. Yet, as the film reaches its climax, the focus shifts to the intimate, handheld, and tactile realities of the protagonists. The cinematography moves from the distant, objective view of the war to the subjective, visceral experience of the characters reclaiming their agency. The lighting design follows this shift, moving from the harsh, high-contrast reds and blacks of the Sith aesthetic to the warm, natural, and diffused light that signifies the presence of the Jedi. The philosophy of the film moves beyond simple binary morality. It embraces a form of existential hope, suggesting that while the universe is replete with structural collapse and the echoes of past trauma, the individual possesses the final authority to dictate their own meaning. The synthesis is found in the final frame, Rey on Tatooine, adopting a name not because it is her birthright, but because she has earned the right to define her own legacy. This is not a film about the triumph of a family line, but about the triumph of the individual over the system. By rejecting the destiny encoded in her DNA, Rey proves that the cycle of history is only as powerful as the person who chooses to participate in it. The Rise of Skywalker serves as a testament to the idea that the soul is not an inheritance, but a continuous act of creation. The subversion question. The Rise of Skywalker is frequently categorized as a reactionary exercise in fan service, a narrative retreat intended to stabilize a fractured franchise through the comfort of familiar tropes. This consensus reading, however, misinterprets the film's frantic pace and relentless accumulation of legacy elements as mere nostalgia. In truth, the film serves as a brutal examination of the burden of historical inheritance, positing that a lineage, whether biological or ideological, acts as a prison rather than a foundation. The film functions as an existentialist manifesto on the necessity of total iconoclasm, where the past is not a resource to be curated but a parasite to be surgically removed to allow for individual agency. The architectural geography of the film reinforces this theme of claustrophobic history. Environments such as the wreckage of the Death Star on Kef Bir are not merely setting, but a physical manifestation of the character's psychological entombment. Rey, Ben Solo, and the remnants of the Resistance navigate worlds defined by ruins, the rusted hulls of starships, the sunken relics of Imperial power, and the literal graveyard of the Sith on Exegol. These landscapes are saturated with the detritus of previous generations, leaving no horizontal space for the present to exist on its own terms. The visual strategy of the film consistently dwarfs the individual against these massive, decaying monuments of the past, signaling that the characters are effectively trapped within a cycle of repetition where their identities are preordained by the sins and victories of their predecessors. The struggle for identity in this world is an epistemological crisis. Rey's journey is defined by the realization that herself is a linguistic and social construct dictated by an ancestral metanarrative she did not author. When the film reveals her lineage, it is presented not as a reward or a secret discovery, but as a violent imposition of a pre-existing category upon her consciousness. Her internal monologue, characterized by a desperate desire to belong to a recognizable lineage, clashes with the reality of her environment, which demands that she define herself through the destruction of those very origins. The film argues that the truth of one's history is a tool of control, and the only path to genuine existence is the rejection of this imposed reality. This philosophical rigor extends to the antagonist, Kylo Ren, whose narrative arc is the logical extreme of the desire to possess the past. His obsession with Vader's shadow is a profound act of self-erasure. By modeling his entire aesthetic and moral framework on a historical figure, he abandons the possibility of a subjective life. His journey is a trajectory toward the disintegration of the ego, culminating in his necessary disappearance into the light. The film frames this not as a heroic sacrifice in the traditional sense, but as the final, absolute surrender of the individual to a collective, abstract force. By ceasing to exist as a distinct entity, he finally escapes the crushing gravity of his own lineage. The film's pacing, often criticized as chaotic, functions as a structural tell that validates this argument. The relentless, almost frantic speed at which characters transition between locations and revelations denies them the luxury of reflection. This is a universe that moves too quickly for traditional legacy building. Characters are forced to act on intuition and immediate necessity because the weight of their history threatens to collapse the present moment entirely. The rapid-fire editing and the constant influx of new, overwhelming stimuli serve to strip away the characters' reliance on established frameworks, compelling them to operate in a state of pure, reactionary existence. The conclusion of the film, marked by the final confrontation on Exegol, provides the definitive proof of this thesis. The destruction of Palpatine is not merely the defeat of a villain, it is the annihilation of the singular, anchoring source of the entire saga's history. The visual language of the final sequence emphasizes the erasure of the past through the totalizing force of the Force, an abstraction that transcends specific, historical narratives. When the protagonist chooses a new name, she is not reclaiming a heritage, she is performing a radical act of self-creation, untethering herself from the bloodline that sought to define her. Ultimately, the film stands as a rejection of the idea that history is a legacy to be honored. It posits that the past is a series of dead ends and restrictive cycles that must be actively dismantled. The discomfort felt by many viewers regarding the film's handling of established characters and lore is a byproduct of this very ambition. By burning the structures of its own history, the film demands a recognition that identity is not inherited but forged in the vacuum created by the total destruction of what came before. The legacy of the film is not its contribution to a continuing story, but its desperate, violent attempt to end the story so that something entirely new might take its place. The anomaly question. The Rise of Skywalker functions as a definitive collision between the inherited mythos of a cinematic dynasty and the modern impulse to codify that history into a rigid, singular truth. While the consensus suggests the film serves as a rushed corrective to its predecessor, it is more accurately understood as a profound exploration of existential inheritance. The film posits that identity is not a static property of bloodlines or titles but a volatile product of choice and persistent action. The central anomaly, Palpatine's return, is frequently critiqued as a narrative convenience, yet it serves a crucial purpose. It literalizes the crushing weight of institutional history that the protagonists must dismantle. By forcing the characters to confront an ancient, malevolent force that insists on their preordained roles, the film creates a reality where true agency is only achieved by physically and symbolically obliterating the past. The world-building emphasizes a universe in a state of terminal decay. Architecture acts as a visual manifestation of this, as characters traverse the rusted-out wreckage of former empires and the sterile, monolithic structures of a resurgent authoritarianism. The visual geography highlights a persistent scarcity. The heroes are perpetually scavenging, utilizing obsolete hardware that contrasts sharply with the sleek, imposing resources of the First Order. This disparity establishes a reality where the baseline experience is one of constant friction against systems that seek to monopolize the future by colonizing the past. Technology and magic are presented not as tools for liberation, but as legacy systems that tether the individual to the mistakes of their ancestors, creating a suffocating environment where the characters are forced to negotiate with the ghosts of previous eras. Character psychology is defined by the struggle to transcend the limits of a pre-written identity. Rey's journey, in particular, is a pursuit of self-definition against the suffocating weight of a fabricated ego, the idea that she is merely a conduit for the power of her lineage. The epistemic fracture occurs when she discovers her true heritage, not as a moment of empowerment, but as a crisis of the self. She is forced to navigate the dissonance between her established moral code and the dark legacy she physically inherits. Her internal struggle is rendered externally through the presence of Kylo Ren, who serves as the Jungian shadow, mirroring her desire for belonging while fully embracing the destructive tendencies she seeks to repress. Their relationship moves from antagonism to a symbiotic realization of their shared trauma, illustrating that the only way to escape their predestined roles is to cease the cycle of competition and choose a path of mutual reclamation. The film's philosophical backbone rests on the rejection of deterministic narratives. It tackles the absurd by showing that the universe offers no inherent meaning to the protagonist, leaving them to forge their own purpose through acts of radical self-sacrifice. While the First Order relies on an ideological apparatus that enforces conformity through the myth of order, the Resistance finds strength in the individual's ability to act outside of structural mandates. The moral calculus shifts from protecting a status quo to the total dissolution of the systems that necessitate the conflict. The protagonists arrive at a point where the only ethical response to a world saturated by the propaganda of the past is to burn that history down, replacing institutional certainty with the volatile freedom of the present. Technically, the film employs a dense visual language that prioritizes scale to emphasize the existential stakes. The use of vast, often synthetic environments serves to dwarf the individual, reinforcing the feeling that the characters are cogs in a machine of epic proportions. The sound design and score work in tandem to create a sense of mounting inevitability, using silence as a punctuated tool to highlight moments of internal realization. The cinematography frequently utilizes dramatic chiaroscuro to visually represent the internal struggle between the light of individual choice and the shadow of inherited trauma. By keeping the camera in constant, kinetic motion, the film captures the desperation of characters who are physically and mentally trapped by the weight of their own history. Ultimately, The Rise of Skywalker serves as a meditation on the cost of closure. The final synthesis arrives when the characters, stripped of their titles and their ancestral ghosts, stand alone in the wreckage of their past. The legacy of the film is found in its insistence that we are not the sum of our origins, but the cumulative result of the choices we make when the myths provided to us finally fail. The film does not merely conclude a series of events, it asserts that the only way to move forward is to destroy the structures that demand we stay the same. It is a work that captures the anxiety of a generation tasked with cleaning up the ruins of a golden age, finding hope not in the preservation of tradition, but in the radical act of moving past it. The synthesis question. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker functions as a deliberate exercise in the reclamation of identity through the annihilation of inherited history. While the film is often discussed as a frantic conclusion to a sprawling space opera, it is actually a rigorous psychological examination of the necessity of systemic erasure. The film asserts that true agency is only attainable once the protagonist rejects the predetermined metanarrative imposed by bloodlines, institutions, and ancient dogmas. This shift from historical determinism to existential autonomy is the central tension of the film, proving that the only way for the individual to become whole is to systematically dismantle the mythic structures that seek to define them. The world of the film is defined by a desperate, entropic scramble for legitimacy. The galaxy exists in a state of terminal decay, where relics of the past, from the scavenged wreckage of Death Stars to the preserved consciousness of Sith Emperors, are treated as the only viable currency. This is an economy of ghosts, where the First Order and the Resistance alike are shackled to the iconography of the previous generation. The film utilizes its architectural geography to manifest this stagnation. Characters are constantly navigating the rusted, literal debris of history, signaling that the society has exhausted its own potential and is now forced to feed upon its ancestors. The visual language of the film, marked by aggressive, high-contrast lighting and deep, shadow-drenched environments, reinforces a binary conflict that is increasingly revealed to be a fragile facade. The state of the galaxy is one of structural collapse, where the reliance on ancient, absolute authorities prevents the emergence of any new socio-political order. At the center of this dissolution is Rey, whose journey is a process of reconciling an internal epistemic fracture. Her arc is defined by the transition from a fabricated ego, constructed around the hope of external validation from parents and Jedi Masters, to the realization that her value is independent of her lineage. The film posits that the core wound is not the absence of history, but the tyranny of it. Rey's struggle with the Force is an act of somatic rebellion. Her physicality, particularly in her training sequences and combat, evolves from reactive mimicry into a fluid, self-actualized expression of power that owes nothing to the archives of the Jedi or the blood of the Sith. The antagonist, Ben Solo, serves as the necessary mirror in this process. He is the manifestation of what happens when one fully embraces the inherited dark metanarrative, yet his inevitable return to the light confirms the film's central thesis: the individual possesses the latent capacity to reject the deterministic trap of their upbringing. Philosophically, The Rise of Skywalker operates as a critique of systemic deontology. The film systematically collapses the grand narratives of both the Sith and the Jedi, revealing them to be mutually parasitic cycles that rely on the total subordination of the individual to the Force as an absolute institutional authority. By the third act, when the voices of past Jedi and the specters of the Sith are silenced or discarded, the film moves into a space of pure existentialism. Rey's final victory is not a triumph of a light-side bureaucracy over a dark-side one, but an assertion that she is the arbiter of her own moral reality. She effectively burns the bridge to the past, constructing a new identity, Rey Skywalker, that functions as a linguistic and ontological severance from the biological and historical chains that preceded her. The craft of the film acts as the primary vehicle for this synthesis. The cinematography prioritizes scale not to emphasize the grandeur of the conflict, but to demonstrate the suffocating weight of history. Wide, sweeping shots of massive, decaying monuments of the past dwarf the protagonists, until the final acts, where the camera pulls in tight, focusing on the singular, decisive movements of the characters as they sever those ties. The visual effects, particularly the integration of light and shadow during the confrontation on Exegol, serve as physical proof of the thesis. As the artificial, lightning-drenched spectacle of the Emperor's throne room fails to contain Rey, the light she generates is not the blue of the Jedi, but a stark, solitary brilliance that consumes the environment. This shift in visual dominance confirms that the protagonist has successfully internalized the power that was once held by the system. Ultimately, The Rise of Skywalker argues that the legacy of a struggle is not found in the preservation of symbols, but in the finality of the break from them. The film's conclusion provides a cathartic release from the recursive loop of Star Wars history. By forcing the protagonist to face the ultimate embodiment of historical determinism and choose a path of radical individual responsibility, the film asserts that a legacy is not a mantle to be inherited, but a creative act to be defined by the self. The final shot, centered on the binary sunset, suggests that while the structures of the past have been dismantled, the individual remains as the sole architect of the future. The resolution is not a return to order, but an endorsement of the liberated individual, proving that the struggle against the weight of history is the only meaningful act of creation. Part 2. Context and world building. Systems, scarcity, and capital. The Rise of Skywalker serves as the terminal point of a long-standing struggle for cosmic hegemony, functioning as a narrative engine driven by the final extraction of resources from a dying galactic infrastructure. The fundamental currency of this reality is the Force, an intangible yet exploitable energy source that the First Order and the Sith Eternal seek to monopolize through technological supremacy and the subjugation of biological lineage. Control over this resource is visualized through the architectural imposition of the Final Order, a vast, hidden armada of planet-killing destroyers manufactured in the bowels of Exegol. This industrial manifestation reveals that the true monopoly is not merely power, but the ability to translate metaphysical potential into hardware capable of dictating the terms of existence. The film operates within a reality defined by profound scarcity, where the remnants of a shattered society scavenge through the literal and figurative debris of historical conflicts. On worlds like Kijimi or Parsarana, the economy is one of survival, characterized by a bustling black market that trades in hyperspace tracking data, forbidden droid memory cores, and ancient linguistic ciphers. These illicit goods underscore what the central civilization lacks: an authentic connection to its own history. The repression of knowledge, specifically the origins of the Jedi and the Sith, creates a desperate market for those seeking the truth behind the propaganda machine of the First Order, which maintains order by suppressing the accessibility of historical truth to ensure that no alternative to their synthetic regime can take root. Labor in this environment is treated as a disposable, commodified asset. The Stormtrooper program represents the ultimate optimization of this process, where the individual's intellect and consciousness are systematically eroded to convert human bodies into interchangeable, hyper-efficient gears within the machine of state conquest. This dehumanization is the baseline condition for the galaxy's citizens, who live in a state of precarious navigation between total subservience to the First Order's rigid, sterile transit hubs and the chaotic, rusted-out peripheries of the Outer Rim. The film emphasizes this disparity through its visual geography. The rich and powerful occupy the high-altitude, neon-lit corridors of centralized command, while the majority of the population is consigned to subterranean or desert ruins, scavenging for obsolete tech to power their meager, daily lives. Technological gatekeeping defines the conflict. The First Order possesses the highest tier of tech, utilizing massive, automated industrial output to maintain a monopoly on force. In contrast, the Resistance and independent scavengers rely on patched-together hardware, utilizing obsolete fighters and ancient, intuitive navigation tools to bypass the state's digital surveillance. This divide reinforces the film's assertion that the prevailing order is collapsing under its own weight, forced to cannibalize its own past to fuel its current dominance. The system is no longer producing new life, it is merely recycling the old, with the Emperor's return serving as a metaphor for a society that has reached the limit of its evolutionary capacity and now survives solely by draining the life force of its descendants. The baseline normal for a civilian is a state of constant, mediated tension. They exist in a world where the propaganda of the ruling class filters every discovery and movement, forcing the protagonist, Rey, to begin her journey not as an empowered hero, but as an exile navigating a landscape of buried truths. The inciting incident disrupts this existence by revealing that the entire galactic hierarchy is an artificial construct, a closed loop designed to preserve the power of an elite few. The film depicts a reality where the very infrastructure of space, hyperlanes, beacons, and navigation arrays is a tether, and true agency is only achieved when the character breaks away from these established routes. Through this, the film demonstrates that the fundamental struggle of the galaxy is the attempt to reclaim the individual self from a massive, predatory machine that views every living being as a resource to be consumed. Architecture and the visual geography. The Rise of Skywalker functions as a vast, kinetic tapestry that prioritizes the visual geography of ruin and legacy, positioning its characters within the physical manifestations of a collapsing imperial order. The film presents a universe defined by the friction between synthetic monolithic power and the reclamation of organic, forgotten spaces. Through its production design, the movie establishes an architectural hierarchy that functions as a silent narrator, documenting the transition from a state of totalizing bureaucratic control to one of fragmented, ancestral reclamation. The visual language of the film is anchored in the stark contrast between the sterile, geometric precision of the Final Order and the chaotic, weathered remnants of the galaxy's history. Exegol, the dark heart of the narrative, serves as the ultimate expression of this power structure. The architecture here is subterranean and oppressive, a vast, hollowed-out cavern that dwarfs the individual. Unlike the sleek, polished corridors of earlier Imperial installations, the structures on Exegol are tectonic, suggesting a civilization that has retreated into the abyss to forge itself out of raw, elemental shadow. This design choice effectively conveys the isolation of the ruling elite, who have abandoned the traditional centers of galactic governance for a hidden, primal fortress. The camera movements throughout these sequences underscore the insignificance of the individual, utilizing wide, deep focus compositions that emphasize the scale of the environment against the fragility of human figures. Conversely, the locations visited by the protagonists, such as the desert of Parsarana or the forested moon of Kef Bir, celebrate the persistence of the organic world amidst the technological decay of a dying age. On Kef Bir, the visual geography centers on the wreckage of the second Death Star, an industrial titan now surrendered to the violent, churning power of the ocean. The production design here treats the technological relic as a geological feature, a rusted-out ruin of a golden age that has been absorbed into the landscape. Characters navigate these spaces by climbing over the jagged, fractured metal of an infrastructure that once sought to control the galaxy. This navigation is tactile and physically demanding, highlighting the shift away from the frictionless, corporate transit spaces seen in earlier galactic centers toward a world that must be traversed on foot, through debris and water. The film's reliance on VFX of scale serves to externalize the psychological journey of its leads. When Rey stands amidst the colossal, half-submerged ruins of the Death Star, the frame is designed to shrink her presence, forcing the audience to process her vulnerability against the weight of history. The integration of these digital environments with the practical performance of the actors creates a sense of tactile realism, grounding the mythic stakes in a tangible environment of decay. The infrastructure of the galaxy is depicted as perpetually in a state of entropy. It is a world where grand, centralized narratives have failed, leaving behind an aesthetic of salvaged parts and repurposing. Even the Millennium Falcon, a central navigational hub, appears increasingly as a living museum of repairs and patches, symbolizing a reliance on the wisdom of the past to survive the technological coldness of the present. The visual strategy of the Rise of Skywalker thus constructs a world where true authority is found not in the pristine, synthetic architecture of the state, but in the integration of the self with the forgotten, organic debris of time. By placing characters within these sprawling, chaotic environments, the film creates a sense of inevitable transition. The geography of the film acts as an epistemological guide, revealing that the true nature of this reality is not the orderly, artificial facade maintained by the propaganda of the First Order, but the messy, persistent, and grounded truth of the remnants left behind. The movement of the camera, often swooping through vast, lonely vistas or tracking low across cluttered, sand-swept surfaces, reinforces the notion that these characters are nomadic survivors in a landscape that has long outlived its creators. The visual geography serves as the final, absolute proof that history is a weight that cannot be discarded, but must be navigated, climbed over, and eventually understood through the physical act of inhabiting the ruins of what came before. Epistemology, information, and society. The Rise of Skywalker serves as a rigorous investigation into the mechanics of history as a tool of control, positing that identity is not an inherent trait but a narrative constructed by those who hold the power to define the past. The film functions as an epistemic battlefield where the protagonist, Rey, grapples with the terrifying realization that her personal history is a weaponized fiction, authored by an unseen architect to dictate her trajectory. While the surface-level discourse centers on the return of an ancient evil, the film operates primarily as a deconstruction of how information, lineage, and propaganda are used to tether the individual to a predestined systemic fate. The world-building of this final chapter emphasizes the scarcity of truth in a galaxy fractured by cycles of totalizing violence. The Resistance operates from a position of profound informational disadvantage, scavenging for knowledge in the ruins of a history they no longer possess. In contrast, the First Order and its resurrected orchestrator utilize a monopoly on heritage to enforce conformity. By positioning Palpatine not merely as a dark force but as an epistemic tyrant, the film reveals that the most dangerous aspect of the Imperial machine is its ability to rewrite the meta-narrative of the galaxy. The official histories propagated by the state are revealed to be hollow shells, designed to keep the populace in a state of perpetual debt to the past. This creates a society starved of context, where individuals exist in a vacuum of self-definition, forced to rely on fragmented relics and ancient, untrustworthy data to navigate their present. The human element of the film is defined by the fracture of the self under the weight of these enforced identities. Rey's journey is a violent struggle against a pre-packaged destiny. She is not fighting a war for territory but for the agency to discard a name she did not choose. Her trauma is manifested through the physical sensation of being pulled toward a legacy of blood that she perceives as an objective reality. When she discovers her origins, the film demonstrates how a fabricated ego can be shattered, forcing the protagonist into an existential confrontation where she must choose between a convenient, state-sanctioned role and the terrifying void of autonomy. This is mirrored in the character of Ben Solo, who exists as a physical representation of the dissonance between inherited trauma and personal moral recalibration. His trajectory proves that the shadow is not an inescapable inheritance, but a layer of conditioning that can be stripped away through the active rejection of the grandfathered narrative. Philosophically, the film grapples with the ethics of heritage. It moves away from the deterministic view that one's utility is defined by their progenitor, instead arguing for an existentialist reclamation of the self. When the final conflict erupts, it is not simply a clash of military might, but a rejection of the propagandistic binary that the villain demands. By choosing to define herself through her chosen affinities rather than her biological metadata, Rey engages in an act of radical defiance against the determinism of the state. The film suggests that the only way to break the cycle of systemic collapse is to dismantle the very infrastructure, the ancient texts, the Sith artifacts, the blood-based hierarchies, that allows for the monopolization of truth. The technical execution reinforces this theme of decay and reinvention. The cinematography emphasizes the scale of ancient, imposing architectures that dwarf the individual, visualizing the oppressive weight of history. The use of vast, crumbling landscapes serves as a metaphor for a society built on the corpses of its own narratives, where the environment is literally composed of the remnants of dead ideologies. The editing and sound design further immerse the viewer in a sense of claustrophobia, where characters are constantly pursued by the ghosts of older, more powerful systems, until the final act shifts the visual language toward light and openness, signaling the liberation of the individual from the architectural trap of the past. Ultimately, The Rise of Skywalker posits that the struggle for liberation is an ongoing, performative act of rewriting one's own existence. The film concludes by discarding the relics that once defined the galaxy's power structure, suggesting that the only way to achieve a genuine future is to relinquish the authority of the past. The synthesis of this narrative is an assertion that identity is a construction of the present, not a legacy of the bloodline. By the final frame, the characters stand amidst the wreckage of their history, having successfully invalidated the propaganda of their ancestors. The takeaway is clear: the system's power resides solely in the individual's willingness to participate in its established history, and the highest form of resistance is the courage to stand unanchored and redefine one's own truth. Friction, law, and the catalyst. The Rise of Skywalker serves as a grand, kinetic culmination of a metaphysical war, positing that the true engine of galactic history is not the accumulation of material wealth or state governance, but the inheritance of spiritual trauma. While the surface-level discourse often centers on the film as a concluding chapter of a franchise, the work functions primarily as a psychological investigation into the burden of ancestry. The film argues that individuals are defined by the competing weight of institutional legacies and the radical, internal necessity of self-actualization. The world of this film is one where the state has completely evaporated, leaving behind a power vacuum filled by ideologically driven factions that operate through pure, unadulterated force. The remnants of the First Order represent the logical extreme of a closed, authoritarian system, one that seeks to rewrite history to suit its current hegemony. Here, the struggle for dominance is not over resources or trade routes, but over the control of the metaphysical narrative. The galaxy exists in a state of terminal, entropic decay, where the artifacts of the past, shattered ships, ancient ruins, and forgotten lore, are the only tools available to address the present crisis. This environment dictates that every actor is a scavenger, forced to construct meaning from the debris of previous, failed iterations of order. At the center of this maelstrom is the epistemic fracture experienced by Rey. Her journey is defined by the sudden, violent collapse of her own origin myth, a process that forces her to reconcile her autonomy with the predetermined trajectory set by her lineage. This is a film about the struggle to transcend the fabricated ego imposed by history. She experiences a profound somatic response to her heritage, treating her bloodline as a physical obstacle that threatens to consume her identity. Her internal discourse is marked by the silence of a person who has been denied the vocabulary to process her own trauma, as the labels provided by the systems of the light and dark sides of the Force prove insufficient to describe her unique existential position. The antagonist, Kylo Ren, serves as a literal manifestation of this same struggle, his journey a mirror image of the protagonist's. His logic is rooted in the belief that the past must be raised to allow for the possibility of a clean, individual future. He operates from a perspective of pragmatism that views the destruction of established dogma as an ethical imperative. Where the system demands that characters adopt the roles of Jedi or Sith, Kylo attempts to dismantle these binary roles entirely, though he remains trapped by his own repetition compulsion, constantly recreating the aesthetic of his grandfather in an attempt to command the authority he lacks. The moral calculus of the film pivots on the transition from a philosophy of systemic adherence to one of individual agency. When Rey confronts the source of her ancestral shadow, the conflict is not merely a duel of energy, but a final, decisive rejection of determinism. The film posits that true power is found in the ability to reject the roles assigned by one's ancestors. This act of revolt is the catalyst that stabilizes the reality of the galaxy, replacing a fragile, inherited order with a new, autonomous foundation. Technically, the film employs a visual language of immense scale to emphasize this struggle for individual identity. The vast, digital environments often dwarf the characters, creating a sense of existential isolation that forces the protagonist to define their own internal light against an overwhelming, uncaring void. The integration of practical sets with high-density visual effects creates a world that feels both tactile and ethereal, reflecting the film's preoccupation with the intersection of history and spirit. The cinematography frequently utilizes low-angle framing during moments of crisis to elevate the human subject above the monolithic, decaying architectures of the past, signaling the triumph of the individual over the systemic weight of centuries. The legacy of the Rise of Skywalker lies in its insistence that identity is a construction, not a discovery. By rejecting the grand narratives that attempted to dictate the character's fates, the film suggests that the final synthesis of the soul is found when the individual ceases to be a vessel for the past and becomes a vessel for their own choices. The closing moments do not offer a return to a status quo, but a movement toward a future where the structures of the past are relegated to memory, and the individual emerges as the final arbiter of truth. The struggle itself, fraught with the danger of erasure, is the necessary path toward liberation, confirming that the most potent act of defiance against a dying system is the assertion of one's own, self-authored name. Part 3. The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. The internal landscape of the Rise of Skywalker functions as an exhaustive meditation on the necessity of constructing one's own identity in the absence of a verified, ancestral record. Rey exists for the majority of the sequel trilogy within the constraints of a fabricated ego, defined by the desperate, self-imposed narrative that her significance is tied to the return of absent, virtuous parents. Her epistemic fracture occurs during the confrontation in the ruins of the Death Star, where the revelation of her lineage as a Palpatine renders her previous moral compass obsolete. Rather than collapsing under the weight of this biological determinism, she experiences a profound shift in self-perception. She realizes that her truth was a lie designed to keep her subservient to a heritage she never chose, prompting an immediate rejection of the binary labels imposed upon her by the Force's historical masters. This transition from an externalized identity to an internalized one creates a sharp tension between what Rey says and the reality she inhabits. She repeatedly attempts to articulate a sense of belonging through the language of the Jedi, using the limited vocabulary of light and dark to process a conflict that has transcended such simplistic moral grammar. She is largely incapable of voicing the terror of her own potential, as the lexicon provided by her mentors is designed to suppress the very power that identifies her as a descendant of darkness. Her silence, particularly in her interactions with Ben Solo, serves as a more accurate indicator of her growth than her spoken pledges of loyalty to the Resistance. She recognizes that the language of her predecessors is a cage, and her ultimate survival depends on her ability to dismantle the dogma that defines the limits of her world. The film forces its characters into states of intense cognitive dissonance, where the act of moral transgression becomes a tool for self-discovery. Rey's use of Force lightning during the transport ship sequence represents the precise moment her action violently contradicts her moral code, yet she justifies this through the pragmatic, desperate necessity of the present moment. This is not an accident of characterization but a deliberate acknowledgement that her true nature exists in the synthesis of her impulses rather than in the restrictive guidelines of the Jedi Order. She moves away from the static, idealized versions of the hero and into a space where her capacity for destruction is integrated into her moral framework. The antagonist, Ben Solo, serves as the literal embodiment of this struggle with the fabricated ego. His trajectory is defined by a desperate, failed attempt to inhabit the persona of Darth Vader, a projection of power that he mistakes for his own identity. His logic is consistently rooted in the idea that he must purge his vulnerability to become the person the galaxy expects him to be. When he eventually rejects this projection, he does not find a new, stable self, but rather a realization that his trauma was a form of self-sabotage intended to keep him in a cycle of repetition. His redemption is not a return to a former self, but the abandonment of the mask entirely. By the conclusion, both Rey and Ben demonstrate that the human element is defined not by the origin of one's power or the history of one's family, but by the conscious decision to define one's trajectory against the gravitational pull of a preordained fate. They move beyond the limits of their inherited languages, choosing the silence of individual agency over the noise of the galaxy's ancestral war. Trauma and somatic experiencing. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker functions as an intricate exploration of identity forged through the crucible of inherited trauma. The core wound defining Rey's psychological trajectory is the abandonment by her parents, a foundational fracture that leaves her perpetually tethered to an impossible expectation of belonging. While the initial installments of the sequel trilogy frame this trauma as a mystery to be solved, the third act clarifies that the wounding is not merely about lineage, but about the terrifying autonomy of the self. By anchoring her origins to the most destructive legacy in the galaxy, the film forces Rey to confront the reality that her trauma is not a destination, but a variable she must actively manipulate to define her own moral architecture. This trauma manifests somatically, etched into the character's physicality through a constant state of hypervigilance. Rey navigates the galaxy with a guarded, bracing posture, her movements characterized by a reflexive economy of motion that betrays a childhood spent in the isolation of Jakku. When confronted with the encroaching presence of Kylo Ren, this physical containment collapses. Their force-based dialogues serve as a psychic intrusion where the boundaries of their bodies effectively dissolve. The somatic experience of their connection, the sudden transference of moisture, sand, or blood across vast, light-years-wide distances, illustrates that for these characters, the body is a porous vessel, easily compromised by the proximity of the other. This is not merely a telepathic communion but a physical occupation that forces both characters to grapple with the discomfort of sharing a sensory existence. Kylo Ren represents the extreme of this somatic volatility. His physical body is a site of constant negotiation between human vulnerability and the rigid, intimidating aesthetic of his armor. His mask, once shattered and discarded, is reforged in this chapter as a literal patching of his fractured ego, an externalized attempt to solidify a crumbling sense of purpose. He treats his own skin as an unreliable narrator, choosing to hide behind synthetic hardware to project a stability he does not possess. This reliance on the mask highlights a desperate coping mechanism, avoidant attachment. He seeks to insulate himself from the emotional resonance of his past by leaning into the brutal, predictable hierarchies of the First Order, effectively attempting to commodify his own trauma into political power. The narrative logic of the film suggests that Rey and Kylo Ren are caught in a cycle of repetition compulsion, constantly gravitating toward one another to reenact the original trauma of their familial disillusionment. Rey's search for parental validation is mirrored in her fixation on the Skywalker legacy, while Kylo Ren's obsession with his grandfather's shadow drives him to replicate the exact patterns of destruction he claims to despise. They are both attempting to exert control over the chaotic, inherited narratives that shaped them. The film portrays this not as a doomed fate, but as a deliberate engagement with the shadow. By forcing the antagonist to operate as a living reflection of the protagonist's darkest fears, the film highlights that their survival depends on the ability to recognize their own impulses within the enemy. Ultimately, the film posits that the trauma stored in the body must be integrated rather than excised. When Rey finally rejects the name Palpatine and claims the mantle of a Skywalker, she achieves a synthesis of her learned survival instincts and a chosen, moral family. The final visual of her standing on Tatooine serves as a profound somatic resolution. The weight of the past is not discarded, but held in equilibrium with her own agency. She reconciles the physical isolation of her early years with the expansive connection she has forged through the Force, proving that the human element of the story is found in the courage to remain grounded in one's own identity, even when the foundations of the world have been fundamentally compromised. The Shadow and the Antagonist. The antagonism within the Rise of Skywalker serves as a profound investigation into the internal architecture of the protagonist, Rey. Kylo Ren functions as the literal, externalized manifestation of Rey's repressed anxieties regarding her lineage and her capacity for darkness. Throughout the narrative, Kylo represents the path of least resistance, a rejection of the burden of self-creation in favor of the comfort provided by a predetermined, toxic legacy. By embodying the volatile, destructive, and isolated aspects of Rey's psyche, Kylo forces her to confront the reality that her own fears are not merely external obstacles to be defeated, but intrinsic components of her identity that must be integrated rather than denied. The antagonist's logic remains strikingly consistent with his epistemological standpoint, rendering his commitment to the dark side a rational choice within his limited world. For Kylo, the past is an insurmountable monolith, and the only way to escape its crushing weight is to burn it down entirely. He views the cycle of Jedi and Sith conflict as a stagnant loop of historical baggage, and his quest for power is an attempt to achieve the ultimate autonomy. From his perspective, he is not merely a villain, but an agent of necessary disruption, seeking to force a new, blank slate reality where individual agency is decoupled from the expectations of dead masters and failed institutions. His pragmatism lies in his ruthless efficiency. If the foundation is rotten, he believes the only logical path is to dismantle the building entirely. This tension is mirrored through Finn, who functions as the secondary character placed in a similar situation but who ultimately chooses the opposite path. While both Rey and Finn are forced to grapple with identities stripped from them by the First Order and the legacy of the Force, Finn's trajectory is one of active community building. Where Rey struggles with the isolating weight of a singular, grand destiny, Finn embraces the collaborative nature of rebellion. He illustrates that one can break free from the programming of a fascistic system by establishing horizontal, rather than vertical, attachments. By choosing to define himself through his loyalty to others rather than his connection to a bloodline or a cosmic mandate, Finn provides a structural alternative to the binary trap that threatens to consume both Rey and Kylo. The relationship between Rey and Kylo shifts from a parasitic dynamic, where each character attempts to feed off the other's emotional vulnerabilities to validate their own moral or nihilistic claims, into a symbiotic synthesis. Initially, they project their flaws onto each other. Rey projects her fear of inner corruption onto Kylo, while Kylo projects his desire for belonging onto Rey, hoping she will serve as the missing piece of his own fractured ego. However, as the film progresses, this projection gives way to a mutual recognition of shared displacement. Their final reconciliation is not a surrender of one to the other, but a merging of their respective experiences. The film argues that true agency arises only when the protagonist stops projecting their insecurities onto external threats and acknowledges their own shadow as a vital part of the self. Ultimately, Rey's projection of her flaws onto her allies serves as an attempt to maintain a facade of objective goodness. By isolating herself from Finn and Poe, she protects them from her perceived instability, yet this isolation only deepens her internal divide. It is only when she stops viewing her internal struggle as a contagion that she can engage with the world authentically. The resolution of the antagonism in The Rise of Skywalker is therefore a victory of integration over bifurcation. By reconciling with the reality of her shadow, personified by Kylo Ren, and choosing to act despite that knowledge, the protagonist moves beyond the rigid moral calculus of her predecessors, proving that the individual is capable of crafting a new, unscripted future that does not rely on the repetition of past trauma. The visual proof of the psyche. The Rise of Skywalker functions as a rigorous examination of the inherited psyche, manifesting the internal turbulence of its protagonists through the tangible decay and hyperscale of its environments. The film treats identity as a construct built upon the architecture of ancestry, suggesting that the self is perpetually haunted by the visual echoes of the past. By placing its characters within ruins that serve as physical extensions of their own psychological fragmentation, the film positions the struggle for agency as an act of reclaiming one's own physical and mental autonomy from the monolithic ghosts that define their heritage. Rey's journey is defined by the tension between her desperate search for belonging and the terrifying realization that her origins are rooted in a legacy of absolute malice. The visual language of the film reinforces this internal fracture, utilizing vast, oppressive landscapes to shrink the individual against the weight of history. When Rey navigates the wreckage of the second Death Star, the environment acts as a physical manifestation of her own psychic trauma. The roiling, jagged seascape and the towering, rusted metalwork represent the externalization of her inner conflict. She is literally traversing the broken, monumental debris of a system that defines her existence. This setting serves as the primary visual proof of her psyche, framing her isolation as a claustrophobic struggle against a monolithic past that refuses to stay buried. The antagonist, Kylo Ren, offers a complementary study in the performance of identity through the lens of trauma and projection. His behavior is a meticulously constructed facade of authority that masks deep, unresolved volatility. The film uses the visual motif of his mask, first shattered, then repaired, as a somatic marker of his fractured ego. The metallic veins visible in the reconstituted helmet suggest an attempt to physically bind a broken sense of self. His environment, characterized by sterile, high-contrast spaces and the cold, unyielding geometry of the First Order, highlights his inability to find vulnerability. He inhabits a world of performative power, where the only allowed interactions are those defined by the hierarchy of the state. When he is confronted with the remnants of his past, his actions are driven by a need to excise the very parts of himself that crave connection, effectively externalizing his self-loathing onto others. The relationship between Rey and Kylo Ren operates as a symbiotic entanglement, where their shared psychic connection, the Force dyad, serves as a bridge that forces intimacy in an otherwise impersonal world. This bond bypasses the limits of conventional communication, allowing for moments of extreme vulnerability that occur in a space devoid of physical or social context. By utilizing digital compositing to overlap their reflections and presence, the film visually suggests that they are mirror images of the same core wound. Their interaction is not merely a clash of ideologies but a forced dialogue between two individuals attempting to process their own existential vertigo. As the film progresses, the facade of the individual identity begins to crumble, revealing the underlying trauma that fuels their actions. The breaking point for these characters occurs when they are forced to confront the reality that their struggle is a recursive loop, a cycle of power that demands the erasure of the self. The final confrontation on Exegol is the ultimate synthesis of this psychological pressure. Surrounded by a vast, desolated landscape that mirrors the emptiness of the ancient order, the characters are stripped of their defensive postures. The visual choice to frame them against the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Sith architecture renders them almost microscopic, emphasizing the fragility of the individual will against the weight of a dying, systemic orthodoxy. The film's technical execution, particularly the integration of practical sets with high-fidelity digital extensions, reinforces this sense of decay. The world is a graveyard of symbols, where obsolete hardware and forgotten monuments dictate the behavior of those currently inhabiting them. This environment acts as an epistemic trap. Characters are confined by the very definitions and roles prescribed to them by history. The eventual triumph of the protagonist lies in their rejection of these predetermined narratives. By discarding the markers of their lineage, the lightsabers, the titles, and the expectations of their respective sides, they achieve a moment of radical self-definition. The conclusion is not a restoration of the old order, but a complete departure from it, marking a transition from a world governed by inherited trauma to one defined by the active, present-tense assertion of the individual self. Through this lens, the film stands as a testament to the necessity of destroying one's own internal mythology to survive the crushing gravity of the past. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. The Rise of Skywalker functions as a definitive examination of how legacy and institutional dogma construct the reality of the individual. At the heart of the narrative is the struggle to reclaim objective truth from the weight of inherited discourse. The film posits that in a galaxy where historical narratives are weaponized by both the First Order and the remnants of the Jedi Order, the characters exist within a prison of language and myth. Rey, Kylo Ren, and the surviving Resistance forces must navigate a reality where their sense of self is constantly mediated by the ghost of past figures, Palpatine, Skywalker, and the abstract ideals of the light and dark sides. The epistemic framework of the film suggests that truth is not a static property of the universe but a fluctuating commodity controlled by those who possess the greatest institutional authority. For the protagonist, the discovery of her lineage acts as a violent fracture in her understanding of reality. This moment forces a transition from a world governed by the comforting, albeit restrictive, binary of the Force to one where the individual must define their own existence outside of the provided nomenclature. The film argues that Rey's rejection of the Palpatine label is an act of epistemic defiance. She chooses to define herself through the language of her actions and attachments rather than the dictates of her biological or inherited history. The discourse within the galaxy is similarly fractured. The film portrays a society drowning in the remnants of a failed grand narrative. The Jedi and the Sith represent competing ideological state apparatuses that have long dictated the boundaries of morality. The characters, particularly Kylo Ren, suffer from the limits of this vocabulary. His inability to articulate his internal contradictions without relying on the tropes of his grandfather's shadow highlights the way systemic narratives preemptively limit human agency. His eventual turn is a linguistic and psychological liberation, a recognition that the binary he was programmed to inhabit is a synthetic construct designed to perpetuate a cycle of violence. The film's reliance on sensory and spiritual phenomena, force projections, ancient ruins, and spectral visitations further complicates the character's grip on reality. Like the Cartesian dilemma, the characters must constantly interrogate their perceptions. The Force acts as the ultimate arbiter of truth, yet it is shown to be a malleable force that responds to the internal convictions of the individual. When Rey confronts the physical manifestation of her past in the wreckage of the Death Star, the scene functions as a breakdown of the illusion of the objective, immutable hero. She realizes that her reality is a product of her own cognitive framing, and she achieves sovereignty only when she creates a new narrative of selfhood. Technically, the film reinforces this struggle through its visual geography and the scale of its environments. The juxtaposition of the ancient, decaying ruins on Exegol with the sleek, oppressive architecture of the Final Order suggests a world where the new is built upon the literal foundations of the old, failing to escape the ghosts of the past. The cinematography isolates characters against these immense, inherited structures, underscoring their insignificance while simultaneously highlighting their capacity to disrupt the system. The use of light, often high contrast and saturated, serves to emphasize the tension between the clarity of personal truth and the obfuscation of inherited dogma. Ultimately, the film presents an existential resolution. It rejects the cyclical nature of history in favor of a radical, self-authored identity. By the final frame, the characters exist in a space where they have successfully dismantled the grand, oppressive narratives that once defined them. The destruction of the Sith Temple is not merely a tactical victory, it is the physical erasure of the institutional apparatus that dictated their epistemic reality. Through this process, the film asserts that truth is an emergent property of the individual's commitment to their own agency. The legacy of the film lies in its contention that when the systems of power collapse, the individual is left with the terrifying and necessary freedom to define the world anew, proving that the struggle to construct one's own meaning is the highest form of resistance against the inertia of history. Metanarratives and social theory. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker functions as a profound examination of how historical metanarratives collapse when they are severed from material reality. While the film is often viewed as a conclusion to an epic cycle, it is more accurately a deconstruction of how ideological state apparatuses attempt to manufacture continuity in the face of inevitable systemic failure. The film posits that the Jedi-Sith binary serves as a stagnant grand narrative, an artificial construct that has failed to provide stability, ultimately functioning as a form of cybernetic control where the struggle between light and dark merely serves to perpetuate a self-correcting feedback loop of conflict. The opening acts of the film reveal a galaxy where the grand narratives of the past have reached a state of hyperreality. The return of Emperor Palpatine symbolizes the ultimate refusal of the past to remain buried, suggesting that the ideological history of this universe is a Baudrillardian simulation where symbols of authority replace actual governance. The ruling class, represented by the remnants of the First Order and the resurrected Sith hegemony, utilizes the iconography of the past to maintain order, proving that power is not derived from contemporary support but from the persistent, terrifying memory of ancient, totalizing structures. Characters like Rey and Kylo Ren find themselves trapped within these inherited frameworks, struggling to define a self that is not merely a byproduct of genetic or ideological programming. The psychological weight of this film lies in its rejection of inherited destiny. Rey's journey is an epistemic fracture where her fundamental understanding of the self, initially anchored to the hope of a noble lineage, collapses upon the realization that her existence is a strategic byproduct of an imperial experiment. This creates a crisis of agency. The film forces its protagonists to confront the limits of their language. They are restricted by a vocabulary of Jedis and Sith that lacks the capacity to articulate the nuance of their own lived experiences. The struggle against these labels becomes the central ethical dilemma, as the characters must navigate the tension between the role they are assigned by history and the actions they choose to take in the present. The visual and technical execution of the film reinforces this sense of entrapment within a decaying legacy. The architecture of Exegol, characterized by massive, sterile, and godlike proportions, serves as a physical manifestation of the system's disregard for individual human life. The VFX here do not merely provide spectacle, they render the individual insignificant against the weight of 1,000 years of accumulated, static ideology. When the resistance arrives, the sheer scale of the fleet imagery underscores the futility of traditional warfare against a foe that has already commodified the very concepts of rebellion and destruction. The film suggests that the system relies on the combatants to play their predetermined parts, turning the act of defiance into a predictable engine of the system's own endurance. Ultimately, the film posits that the only path forward is the radical rejection of the binary grand narrative. The act of becoming all the Jedi is not a surrender to the old systems, but a synthesis that acknowledges the failure of those narratives to provide a meaningful future. By discarding the restrictive labels of the past, the characters dismantle the ideological state apparatus that has necessitated their misery. The concluding moments of the film do not provide a return to a golden age, but rather a quiet, existential clearing. The final imagery of the twin suns on Tatooine acts as a reclamation of geography from the suffocating weight of history. The protagonists have not merely won a battle, they have exited the cycle of cybernetic control, proving that meaning is not something to be inherited from a grand narrative, but something that must be actively constructed in the absence of one. The film's legacy lies in this transition from a world governed by static, ancient truths to one where the individual is finally liberated to determine their own existence, no longer a cog in a machine of cyclical, predetermined moral struggle. Ethics and the moral calculus. The Rise of Skywalker serves as a rigorous investigation into the moral weight of heritage and the mechanics of existential agency. Within the film's ethical architecture, the central conflict operates as a high-stakes variation of the trolley problem, forcing its protagonist to navigate the friction between deontological duties, those ancestral and categorical imperatives inherited from the past, and the utilitarian necessity of ensuring the survival of the collective. Rey's journey is defined by the tension between her desire to adhere to a fixed, prescribed moral identity as a Jedi and the reality that her biological origins are tethered to the ultimate embodiment of cosmic destruction. The film posits that moral personhood is not an inherent trait bestowed by lineage, but an active, ongoing construction of the self, achieved through the deliberate rejection of deterministic paths. This argument finds its most potent expression in the film's treatment of the non-human and the cloned entity. Through the figure of Palpatine, the film explores the ethics of artificiality and the commodification of existence. The Emperor represents an ontological nightmare where the body is merely a vessel, a replaceable commodity utilized to perpetuate an endless, recursive grip on power. In contrast, characters like Finn and the redeemed Ben Solo demonstrate that agency emerges precisely when one defies their original programming or intended function. Finn's awakening from his conditioned role as a stormtrooper serves as a profound affirmation of moral autonomy. He asserts his humanity by actively choosing to participate in a cause that offers him no systemic mandate, thereby redefining personhood as the capacity for uncoerced decision-making. The film leans into the Camusian concept of the absurd revolt, where the protagonist is confronted with a universe that appears cruelly ordered by a malevolent, centuries-old design. Rather than succumbing to the nihilism inherent in Palpatine's vision of a reality defined solely by power and domination, Rey and Ben construct a new meaning through communal sacrifice. Their moral calculus moves beyond the simple preservation of self or the rigid adherence to the binary codes of light and dark. Instead, they embrace the necessity of total commitment to the present moment, treating the destruction of the past not as an act of erasure, but as an act of creation. The film argues that the moral actor must confront the terrifying emptiness of a world without predestination and decide, through sheer force of will, to build a future that is structurally independent of the systems that preceded it. Furthermore, the film challenges the ethics of ignorance by presenting the truth as a destabilizing, albeit necessary, catalyst for growth. The characters are repeatedly forced to confront the gaps in their own metanarratives, the lies they were told about their place in history and their connection to the conflict. The film asserts that the suffering incurred by uncovering these truths is superior to the false comfort of an ordered, deceptive existence. When the characters accept the reality of their lineage and the failures of their predecessors, they gain the capacity to act with true moral authority. By shedding the illusions of the grand, historical narratives that previously governed their choices, they move toward an authentic state of being. Ultimately, the Rise of Skywalker frames the final battle not merely as a physical struggle, but as an ideological rejection of the cycle of inherited violence. The protagonist chooses a path that prioritizes the preservation of life over the dictates of institutionalized dogma. This choice reflects a mature ethical framework where the individual recognizes that their existence is intimately tied to the survival of the others. By the conclusion, the film reaches a synthesis wherein the collective's future is secured through the individual's refusal to become the successor to a corrupt legacy. The moral triumph lies in the decision to break the feedback loop of the past, proving that the individual's capacity to choose is the only meaningful variable in an otherwise deterministic universe. Determinism, agency, and time. The Rise of Skywalker functions as a definitive exploration of the tension between inherited identity and the radical autonomy of the self. While the film is often viewed as a culmination of established galactic lineage, it actually serves as a profound meditation on the collapse of determinism. The narrative posits that while individuals are born into systems of crushing historical gravity, they possess the capacity to rupture those cycles through acts of pure, unscripted will. The film rejects the notion that the past is a blueprint for the future, instead presenting reality as a series of choices that continuously overwrite the structural mandates imposed by dynastic legacy and ancient dogma. The film's central conflict revolves around the characters' confrontation with their own programmed destinies. Rey operates under the pervasive shadow of her lineage, a predetermined identity designed to slot her into a pre-existing ideological machine. Her journey represents an active transition from being a defined asset within a historical grand narrative to becoming an autonomous agent who defines the moral architecture of her own life. The appearance of the Sith Eternal and the resurrection of Palpatine serve as the ultimate symbols of stagnant, deterministic power, a structure that relies on the repetition of history to maintain control. By attempting to force Rey into this role, the antagonist attempts to prove that the individual is merely a component of a larger, immutable cosmic apparatus. The resolution of this conflict occurs when the protagonist recognizes that the system, regardless of its reach, is hollow if it lacks the agency of the present. The film illustrates that true authority is not inherited through blood or established through institutional doctrine, but is forged through the voluntary alignment of one's actions with a chosen ethical path. This shift is most visible in the internal transformation of Kylo Ren. His path from the rigid constraints of a dark, inherited legacy to his emergence as Ben Solo demonstrates that freedom is essentially the courage to discard one's scripted role in favor of an authentic existence. The moment he casts aside his lightsaber is the moment he ceases to be an instrument of a pre-written history and begins to occupy the role of an architect of his own moral reality. The philosophical underpinnings of the film rely heavily on this rejection of teleological inevitability. The Force, within this framework, acts as a reflection of the character's psychological state rather than a predetermined, immutable law. It behaves as a medium for agency. Those who attempt to weaponize it as a tool of destiny fail because they misunderstand the fundamental nature of connection. The climax, in which all past Jedi lend their presence to the moment of decision, does not signify a surrender to the past, but rather a validation of the current act of defiance. The characters utilize the wisdom of those who came before to facilitate their own departure from the cyclical traps of previous eras. This existential struggle is amplified by the technical execution of the film. The visual language, characterized by grand, sweeping scales and the depiction of overwhelming, ancient architectures, emphasizes the insignificance of the individual against the massive weight of systemic history. Yet, the cinematography consistently brings the focus back to the human form, isolating characters in the midst of crumbling environments to highlight their capacity to stand apart from the wreckage. The juxtaposition of the massive, dark, and sterile aesthetic of Exegol against the organic, kinetic energy of the protagonists reinforces the idea that the human spirit is the only force capable of disrupting a static, dying order. The final synthesis of the film offers an optimistic vision of human potential. In the closing sequence, as Rey adopts a new identity, the narrative confirms that the future is not a destination determined by one's origins, but a space opened by the act of creation. The film concludes that the struggle for meaning is not a process of recovering a lost past, but of asserting value in the present. By choosing to define herself outside the binary of the systems that sought to claim her, the protagonist transforms the concept of legacy. She demonstrates that while society and history provide the environment, the individual remains the final arbiter of truth. The film stands as a testament to the idea that the power to act, when wielded with intention, is the ultimate force for dismantling the illusions of inevitability, leaving behind a world where the future remains genuinely, and terrifyingly, open. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The Rise of Skywalker employs a visual language defined by relentless velocity and expansive spatial hierarchies, functioning as a cinematic engine that prioritizes momentum over static composition. The film's cinematography establishes a clear visual hierarchy, utilizing low-angle perspectives to emphasize the mythic stature of its central figures, particularly during the confrontation between Rey and Kylo Ren. These framing choices elevate the characters from mere participants in a galactic conflict to embodiments of cosmic forces, where their positioning within the frame, often isolated against monumental backdrops, signifies the immense weight of their ancestral legacies. The camera acts as a sentient witness, favoring dynamic, sweeping crane shots that glide over expansive landscapes, such as the deserts of Parsarana or the ruins of the Death Star, to emphasize the insignificance of the individual amidst a sprawling, historical geography. This sense of scale is further reinforced through the deliberate use of negative space, which isolates the characters in moments of existential transition. When Rey faces the mirrored temptation of the dark side, the film utilizes vast, empty framing to highlight the internal void she must reconcile, forcing the viewer to confront the psychological isolation inherent in her search for identity. Conversely, the film's color palette functions as an architectural framework for emotional states. The stark, high-contrast lighting of the Imperial environments, characterized by jagged reds, deep blacks, and surgical whites, visualizes the rigid, oppressive nature of the First Order's philosophy. This contrasts with the warmer, more organic tones found in the Resistance's gatherings, where soft, diffused lighting suggests a collective, humanistic hope. The shifting colors act as a visual barometer, signaling the fluidity of the characters' allegiances and the instability of their moral bearings. The film's reliance on light as a narrative device is perhaps most pronounced in its treatment of the Force. Light is rarely a neutral element, it is an active participant that reveals truth or masks deception. In the subterranean throne room, the interplay of harsh, strobe-like light and deep shadow creates an environment of intense psychological instability, mirroring the characters' inner conflict as they move between the allure of power and the burden of empathy. This chiaroscuro approach allows the film to externalize the internal struggle, turning the environment into a reflection of the protagonist's psyche. The cinematography maintains a consistent, polished sheen, utilizing depth to compress characters against their surroundings during moments of high tension, effectively trapping them within their own histories. By positioning characters at the center of overwhelming environments, the visual design underscores the film's assertion that personal identity is formed through the negotiation with, an ultimate transcendence of, overwhelming systemic structures. The technical execution ensures that even in the quietest moments, the characters remain anchored by the visual gravity of the settings they inhabit, affirming that their journeys are deeply rooted in the physical and spiritual landscape of their reality. The result is a visual experience that treats every frame as a culmination of the series' history, utilizing movement and light to propel the characters toward their final, inevitable resolution. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. The Rise of Skywalker functions as an expansive exercise in digital density, where the friction between tangible practical sets and algorithmic visual expansion defines the viewer's immersion. The film relies heavily on the integration of synthetic environments with high-contrast, location-based lighting to anchor its sprawling narrative. Throughout sequences on planets like Parsarana or the wreckage-strewn moons of Endor, the visual effects team utilizes a sophisticated approach to global illumination that attempts to marry the chaotic geometry of digital landscapes with the specific, often harsh, sunlight captured on-site. This consistency in black levels and color temperature allows for a seamless transition between the actors, performing on tactile, physical substrates, and the vast, computer-generated horizons that loom behind them. The film's approach to digital physics remains rooted in a logic of kinetic weight. When the protagonists traverse the shifting sands or engage in high-speed skiff chases, the digital debris and environment react with a consistent density that mirrors the practical world established in the series' history. The VFX pipeline prioritizes this tangible mass, objects possess inertia, and digital dust clouds kick up with a volume and turbulence that respect the established lighting environment. This adherence to physical realism prevents the synthetic elements from drifting into the weightless, floaty quality that often plagues high-budget spectacles, ensuring that the spectacle remains grounded in a sensory reality that the audience can intuitively grasp. In moments of extreme technical artifice, such as the spectral manifestation of characters or the subterranean exploration of ancient ruins, the film grapples with the technical uncanny. The integration of digital assets avoids the hollow aesthetic of the uncanny valley by emphasizing texture and environmental reflection over pure, smooth-surfaced mimicry. The life within these sequences is maintained through subtle, micro-flickering light sources, the glow of a lightsaber, the ambient phosphorescence of a cavern, or the refraction of light through shifting atmosphere. By focusing on how light plays across skin and fabric, the production bypasses the lack of complex ocular saccades, instead convincing the viewer through the behavior of light within a shared, high-fidelity environment. Beyond the obvious spectacles, the film demonstrates a mastery of invisible VFX, the quiet labor of digital artistry. Extensive sky replacements and complex, multi-layered compositing work to obscure the limitations of practical shooting locations, effectively expanding the scale of the world without sacrificing the intimacy of the character beats. These quiet effects maintain the cohesion of the frame, ensuring that the viewer remains tethered to the emotional arc of the characters rather than distracted by the boundaries of the digital canvas. This invisible layer of craft serves as the connective tissue for the film's grander, more bombastic set pieces. The economic aesthetic of the film is one of opulent, maximalist precision. Every frame displays a commitment to complex textures and high-density detail, signaling a significant investment in the visual language of the series. The compositing is executed with such rigor that the distinction between the physical camera work and the synthetic extensions remains almost entirely obscured. This visual abundance is not merely a display of budget, but a strategic choice that reinforces the scale of the cosmic conflict. The depth of the global illumination and the granularity of the world-building contribute to an atmosphere of pervasive, lived-in history. By sustaining this level of technical craft throughout the entirety of its runtime, the film establishes a visual consistency that allows the audience to accept the increasingly surreal and high-stakes nature of the finale, ensuring that the technical spectacle always serves, rather than subsumes, the narrative journey. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Star Wars, Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker functions as an expansive exercise in sensory density, where the convergence of hyperkinetic editing, layered soundscapes, and deliberate visual staging serves to reconcile the fractured legacy of its protagonists. The film achieves its narrative weight through a relentless audiovisual rhythm that mirrors the internal volatility of its central figures, Rey and Kylo Ren. By treating sound as a physical participant in the storytelling process, the production creates an environment where the psychological state of the characters is externally manifest in the chaotic, high-fidelity world they inhabit. The sonic architecture of the film is defined by a sophisticated interplay between diegetic sound and the operatic score. John Williams' recurring themes do not merely underscore the action, they act as a connective tissue that binds the disparate locations of the galaxy into a cohesive, if frenetic, whole. During moments of profound interpersonal connection between Rey and Kylo Ren, the sound design frequently shifts from the thunderous, overwhelming cacophony of starship combat to a hyper-focused, intimate audio perspective. In these instances, the background noise of the galaxy, the hum of engines, the crackle of distant explosions, is stripped away, replaced by the immediate, crystalline quality of the protagonists' voices and the localized, diegetic feedback of their environments. This manipulation of the sound field effectively isolates the characters within their own existential bubbles, forcing the audience to experience their psychic tether as a tangible, inescapable reality. Rhythm and editing operate in tandem to sustain this sensory intensity. The pacing is intentionally calibrated to reflect a state of constant, escalating pressure. Fast cut sequences during the Battle of Exegol are not simply functional, they function as a rhythmic metaphor for the dissolution of the status quo. The rapid alternation between wide, cosmic-scale shots of the fleet and tight, claustrophobic close-ups of the cockpits creates a jarring, disorienting experience that mimics the protagonist's struggle to maintain a sense of self amidst overwhelming historical and inherited expectations. This aggressive, high-velocity editing serves as the heartbeat of the film, ensuring that the urgency of the character's psychological breakthroughs is felt as a physical sensation by the viewer. Visual effects and cinematography further reinforce this sensory manipulation. The production utilizes high-contrast lighting, specifically the stark, desaturated gloom of Exegol set against the blinding, ethereal light of the Force, to create a visual language of absolute moral and psychological extremity. The digital integration of the environment with the performances is seamless, allowing for long, fluid camera movements that track the characters through expansive, ruinous landscapes. These wide shots do not merely establish the scale of the world, they emphasize the profound isolation of the individual standing against the weight of a dying empire. The technical craft works to bridge the gap between the monumental scale of space opera and the interiority of trauma, as the lens often captures the subtle, micro-expressions of the actors even when they are positioned against the vast, complex digital canvases of the film's climax. When the film employs silence, it is deployed with calculated precision, acting as a rupture in the established sensory flow. At key moments of revelation or sacrifice, the total removal of ambient noise and music draws the audience into a vacuum, stripping away the spectacle to focus entirely on the character's internal transformation. This silence functions as a powerful instrument, signaling that the characters have reached the limits of their external reality and are forced to confront the truth of their own identity. By balancing this stillness against the overwhelming roar of the galaxy, the film effectively maps the internal journey of its leads onto the physical landscape. The craft and illusion here do not merely supplement the narrative, they provide the primary architecture through which the audience experiences the collapse of one era and the birth of a new, reclaimed individual agency. In this way, the technical execution establishes a definitive unity between the visual spectacle of the franchise and the intimate, psychological stakes of the final act. Synthesis of craft. The visual and technical language of Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker functions as a deliberate synthesis of digital maximalism and tactile heritage, grounding the film's metaphysical stakes in an aesthetic of hyperdensity. By prioritizing an aggressive, rapid-fire approach to cinematography, the film mirrors the internal fragmentation of its protagonists, Rey and Kylo Ren. The choice of lens work, particularly the frequent reliance on long lenses during the intimate exchanges between these two, serves to physically compress the space around them. This technique effectively isolates the characters from the sprawling, chaotic backdrop of the galactic conflict, forcing the viewer to confront the vacuum of their shared destiny. By pulling the background into a soft, indistinct bokeh, the visual language emphasizes that for the protagonists, the external war is secondary to the epistemic collapse occurring within their own minds. The film leans into a high-contrast aesthetic that utilizes the principles of chiaroscuro to externalize the internal struggle between light and dark. Throughout the desert landscapes of Parsarana and the storm-ravaged ruins of the Death Star, the lighting design is intentionally harsh, casting long, jagged shadows that serve as physical manifestations of the character's Jungian shadows. This is particularly evident in the final confrontation on Exegol, where the lighting shifts from the sterile, artificial blues of Palpatine's throne room to the chaotic, flickering reds of the Sith lightning. The technical execution of this sequence acts as a metaphor for the final integration of the self. The light does not merely illuminate the environment, but consumes it, rendering the distinction between the hero and the villain's shadow fluid and interdependent. The film's digital craft achieves a standard of density that actively shapes the viewer's perception of scale. Through the use of vast, procedurally generated crowds and intricate set extensions, the VFX work consistently asserts the insignificance of the individual against the sheer weight of history. The integration of these digital elements with practical location shooting creates a textured, tangible world where the synthetic and the organic occupy the same space. This is a deliberate choice to ground the fantastical in a reality that feels weathered and decaying. The debris-strewn interiors of the crashed Star Destroyer or the rusted outposts on Kijimi reflect a society living in the aftermath of a golden age, with the VFX team layering in subtle details, shifting dust, atmospheric haze, and realistic light diffusion to ensure the digital artifice remains imperceptible. The choreography of the frame frequently favors wide-angle compositions during group movements, emphasizing the collective pressure of the resistance, which contrasts sharply with the claustrophobic, tightly framed shots that define the protagonist's solitude. In moments of high tension, the camera moves with a frantic, handheld energy that replaces the need for overt exposition, allowing the physical action to communicate the character's lack of escape. This fluidity of movement serves to suggest that the characters are caught in a feedback loop of trauma, where every action they take is a frantic attempt to break free from the narrative gravity established by their predecessors. Ultimately, the technical spectacle of the final act serves as the film's most significant philosophical statement. The synthesis of high-fidelity CGI, precise color grading, and an expansive, layering sound mix culminates in a singular, technically impressive sequence, the convergence of all Jedi voices into Rey. Here, the technical craft transcends mere spectacle. By isolating the human voice from the overwhelming roar of the cinematic environment, the sound design creates a moment of profound, quiet clarity. This choice proves that the most impactful technical decisions in the film are those that bridge the gap between the monumental scale of the galaxy and the singular, internal truth of the hero. The craft of the film does not merely support the story, it creates the vocabulary through which the characters define their own reality, proving that in a world of inherited myth, the most essential act is the technical and personal refinement of one's own legacy. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker serves as a definitive argument for the necessity of self-determined legacy within a universe defined by ancestral weight. While the film is frequently viewed through the lens of franchise conclusion and fan service, it functions more profoundly as a meditation on the liberation of the individual from the gravity of history. The narrative posits that identity is not a static inheritance but an active, ongoing construction. Rey's journey, culminating in her rejection of Palpatine's dark lineage in favor of the Skywalker name, encapsulates the film's central thesis that the self is an earned designation, not a biological mandate. The film operates within a reality where institutional power is perpetually decaying, forcing characters into a state of constant, scavenged improvisation. The visual geography, from the cluttered, circuit-strewn ruins of the desert world Parsarana to the sterile, oppressive architecture of the Sith stronghold on Exegol, reinforces this dichotomy between the organic survival of the protagonists and the artificial, parasitic nature of the antagonist. Kylo Ren and Rey occupy a psychic space defined by the tension between their inherent roles in a galactic struggle and their desperate search for personal autonomy. The film illustrates this struggle through high-contrast lighting and kinetic, fluid camera movements that track their proximity, using the Force dyad as a physical manifestation of their psychological tethering. Their connection represents an attempt to bridge the divide between two different methods of responding to trauma: Ren's destructive repetition compulsion and Rey's avoidant, yet hopeful, search for belonging. The philosophical architecture of the film leans into a rejection of deterministic fatalism. The return of Emperor Palpatine serves as the ultimate anchor of the old order, representing a rigid, hierarchical view of the universe where power flows downward through lineage. By positioning this as the antagonist's worldview, the film creates a moral framework where the only path to genuine victory is the total destruction of that vertical, bloodline-based power structure. The characters must engage in an absurd revolt against the weight of their own history, choosing to act in defiance of what is expected of them. The film frames this act of naming, Rey choosing the Skywalker identity, as an assertion of deontological virtue, where the duty to protect the future outweighs the obligation to appease the ghosts of the past. Technically, the film utilizes an aggressive, maximalist aesthetic to reflect the instability of its universe. The rapid-fire pacing and dense VFX environment serve to immerse the audience in the urgency of a collapsing status quo. The digital craftsmanship, particularly in the rendering of the Sith fleet and the atmospheric, lightning-drenched skies of Exegol, functions as a visual metaphor for the chaos of a system losing its grip on reality. The sound design complements this with a layering of iconic motifs that become increasingly fragmented, mirroring the characters' own fractured understanding of their history. The film's reliance on these sensory extremes highlights a fundamental point: in a universe where the truth has been mediated by propaganda and ancient grudges, individual perception and action become the only reliable sources of knowledge. The legacy of the film is cemented in its final moments on Tatooine, where the recurring visual of a binary sunset ties the conclusion directly back to the series' origin. However, the meaning has shifted. The sunset no longer represents the longing for an escape from an ordinary life, but rather the quiet satisfaction of a life successfully reclaimed. The final shot is a synthesis of the journey from isolation to community, providing a sense of catharsis that validates the struggle against determinism. The Rise of Skywalker ultimately demands that the viewer recognize the agency inherent in their own existence. It posits that while we are all born into pre-existing systems, social, familial, and ideological, we possess the singular, radical power to redefine our relationship to those systems. The film finds its strength in this final, defiant assertion: the future is not a product of what came before, but a result of the choices made in the present. It leaves the viewer not with the exhaustion of a cycle completed, but with the existential challenge of building something new in the wake of the old.